this was inevitable. Star Wars The Phantom Menace, 25 years later, got a special release this weekend for May the 4th, and its 25th anniversary this month. Came out in 1999, written and directed by George Lucas, starring everybody from Liam Neeson, Ewan McGregor, Jake Lloyd, Natalie Portman, and a bunch of other people that have gone on to do various things in their careers. I know some of you were excited to hear my thoughts on The Phantom Menace, but really, what else can I say about this movie that hasn't been said already? I say that about a lot of other movies in the past on here, but this one I'm finding really hard to do straight out the gate. Probably more so than any other that we've experienced in the history of cinema or entertainment. That anything that I could possibly add has more than likely already been iterated by another critic, another fan, audience member, YouTuber. You get the idea. On the flip side though, I feel like I have to say something because the newfound love and appreciation or bandwagon love that the prequels have gotten in the last several years, it's gotten to the point where I find it to be rather insufferable. Whereas 6+ years ago, the opposite was true. The prequels were probably some of the most loathed pieces of fiction that I've ever come across, as far as the discourse at least. The hype train surrounding The Phantom Menace leading up to its release in 1999 was unlike any other movie that we've seen. Back in the day before we were able to buy tickets off of an app, we had to wait in line for an X amount of time in order to get tickets, and some people would actually go to a theater for another showing in order to see the trailer, and then they would walk right out of the theater. 16 years after the ending of the original trilogy, fans wanted to see more from the galaxy far, far away. George Lucas had publicly said that he had some ideas for at least 3 trilogies. Of course, any OT purist will tell you the original trilogy and that was it. I think he had an idea for all 3, but he wanted to see how one trilogy would do and then he would decide where to go from there. I'm already starting to kind of push back against a certain type of consensus in the Star Wars fandom. And even with that, the Star Wars fan base is so huge, ranging from people who overanalyze what they're watching to those who don't really think about what they're watching, along with those that are somewhere in the middle, kind of like me. And this film, along with the following 2 prequels, introduced a whole new generation to Star Wars, where I know a lot of people in my age range at least, or even younger, consider this and the other 2 prequels to be their favorites in the franchise. And I'm not in any way trying to demean any of those people or any of those opinions, because Star Wars is different for everybody. Nearly 50 years after the inception of the franchise, Star Wars is in a much different place now than it was back then. Whether you like it or not, that's just the way things go. Before we dive into The Phantom Menace, let me just get a few things out of the way. Again, I'm not in any way going to try to demean anybody for liking this movie or the following prequels. If you couldn't tell by the shirt, I actually have a similar affinity for the sequels. Of course, I love the originals. Who doesn't love the originals? And a lot of my takes are not going to be that original. This is probably what you would hear from other YouTubers 6+ years ago, particularly Hello Greedo, Red Letter Media, and Chris Stuckman before he changed his tune on the prequels. And the same thing could be said for Jeremy Johns, because I just saw that he posted a 25 years later video on Phantom Menace. I didn't even bother to watch it because I had a feeling of what he was going to say, but whatever. And I know there's some people out there who are going to say that was the point for certain character portrayals and whatnot. We'll get to that when we get to the characters, but I'm going to say this right now. Portraying your characters as emotionless robots is not a good idea. But I'm also going to try to balance the negative with the positive, because there are some things that this movie does offer in a positive way. With all that out of the way, if you somehow have never seen this movie, spoiler warning galore. As I said, the lead up to The Phantom Menace was unlike anything that we have seen in pop culture. And over the last 25 years since this movie's release, the consensus has shifted drastically, including with the following 2 prequels. Fans, of course, had things to say upon its release and how they felt that it destroyed their childhood, leading to various people just putting their thoughts out on the internet world, which led to the creation of what we know as the modern movie discourse online that we see today. Quite a few YouTubers that I used to watch a decade ago did not hesitate to jump on the bandwagon in regards to the slashing of the prequels. Now, in light of the sequel trilogy, have changed their tune completely, where they now practically love the prequels. You can say that they genuinely feel that way and they had a genuine change of heart, but I also think it's in a way of staying in line with the current and not trying to face any backlash. I feel like Star Wars fans, most of the time, not all the time, fall into that line of thinking. And what we see as modern movie discourse now, this really all started with The Phantom Menace. Some people will say that The Last Jedi caused that, but really it all started back in 1999. And that kind of discourse has bled into various other franchises and other types of movies, like with Marvel, DC, Batman, Spider-Man, particularly when it comes to nitpicking and strange comparison and various other talking points that we see in videos like CinemaSins or the Honest trailers, basically growing into the modern movie discourse that we know now. Now, while we're on that subject, we cannot talk about this movie and its discourse without at least acknowledging once the Red Letter Media video.
Star Wars The Phantom Menace was the most disappointing thing since my son. I mean, how much more could you possibly f*** up the entire backstory to Star Wars? Nothing in The Phantom Menace makes any sense at all. It comes off like a script written by an 8-year-old.
Hey, can I get some pizza rolls? It's what we call a protagonist. Some of the aspects of those reviews are dated at best, but I still think a lot of those points hold up. And also, one more thing about the discourse surrounding the prequels. A lot of people will love to point out how the prequels were at least consistent with their vision in a way to slag off the sequel trilogy since they didn't really have much of an overall narrative plan. This was also reiterated by the Goldman in his 24 Years Later video on Phantom Menace, which I'll put the link in the description for you if you're curious. But to quote Goldman, one trilogy lacking something does not make the other good. Just because the sequels weren't exactly planned out properly, that doesn't mean the prequels are good for that reason alone. It's like saying the Amazing Spider-Man movies are better than the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man because Spider-Man has more of a sense of humor, that he actually has web shooters, or that Gwen Stacy's not a damsel in distress. Peter Parker lacking a sense of humor in the original 3 does not make Andrew Garfield's portrayal good. That's a whole nother topic entirely, but hopefully you guys get what I mean. I'm sorry I really went on with a lot of stuff there, I just had to get this out of the way. But for anyone who doesn't really know what the plot is, this takes place about 30 years before the events of the original trilogy. There's a certain military faction called the Trade Federation that's about to launch this illegal invasion of the planet Naboo. And 2 Jedi Knights are sent to investigate what's happening, Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi. We get the classic opening crawl with John Williams music. The description of what's going on in the opening crawl to me feels very lackluster and uninspired. If you were watching the original 3 movies and then jumping into the prequels, at least for myself, we as the viewer can tell something doesn't feel right. It's really easy to compare this to the opening sequence of A New Hope. This is a different way to introduce Star Wars, and it's a different place in the timeline, so okay, fair enough. But then as the opening scene goes on, the characters of Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, played by really great actors, mind you, don't really leave much of an impression, are very stoic, and have a very formal type of bond, and we don't really get to know what they're all about. And this only carries on throughout the rest of the movie. It doesn't hurt to kind of lighten the mood by having some normal chit-chat or some type of human interaction where you actually feel like they're people. I know this has been talked to death before already, so this isn't new ground. But right off the bat, George Lucas doesn't really make a good impression with introducing us to the 2 main characters. I guess if there is any main character, Qui-Gon will probably be the one that gets the top billing. There really is no main character, which has been pointed out by Red Letter Media, neither here nor there. And then when the Trade Federation realizes that these 2 guys are Jedi Knights and not ambassadors, they send the droids in to attack. They manage to cut down the droids with barely any struggle. And somehow they manage to jump really far when those 2 destroyer droids show up. I always find that kind of hilarious that they jump so fast away instead of maybe Qui-Gon pulling down a part of the ceiling or throwing some kind of a smoke bomb to the point where the droids couldn't see where they were going. I know that's very nitpicky, but it's just something I noticed upon rewatch. And the thing about the Trade Federation, they're not exactly that menacing. As opposed to the originals with the Empire and even the sequels with the First Order, we at least get the impression that there's some kind of threat from these 2 entities. There's at least some type of respect that they demand from people. Especially with the Stormtroopers, where they're actual people inside those helmets. Didn't really have the greatest accuracy, but there was at least people there that were trained, and we felt the tension whenever the protagonists were facing off against them. With this one, we have battle droids that, I'll admit, in this one do feel somewhat menacing, especially in comparison to the other 2 prequels, where they just come off as very comedic. They at least exude some type of commanding authority. But it really comes down to their leaders, the Viceroys, Newt Gunray in particular, who are just probably the biggest morons besides the Jedi in all 3 of these movies. One particular moment when the 2 Viceroys are talking with Darth Sidious in the hologram, and the one character says, "You didn't tell him about the missing Jedi?"
No need to report that until we have something to report.
Did it ever occur to you that this guy is a Force user and he might be sensing that you're holding something back? That should be the first thing that crosses your mind. But then we get down to the planet of Naboo, where the Trade Federation is invading the forest, and Qui-Gon runs into Jar Jar Binks. And that's where the movie really goes south for a lot of people. When it comes to Jar Jar, anything that could be said about this character has already been said. What I will say though, I don't hate the character, but he does not need to be in here. Most of the time I find him to be insufferably annoying because I don't really know what the hell he's saying.
You'd say, boom to gasser, then crash into buses, hey blibber, then vanish. No again, the beans hereabouts call Wazy. We shall be robbed and crunched.
You understand any of that?
I think he said, Hoyle, how to, with the going, you were there but here now, you are for me to see, how'd you do? Thanks for clearing that up.
He's not all annoying, though. There's one particular moment that he has with the Queen Amidala, which I've always really liked, where he kind of consoles her and comforts her when she's thinking about what's going on with her people on Naboo, and he talks about how Gungans don't go down without a fight. I just wish George Lucas did more of that with Jar Jar. Now, in a movie like Star Wars, you do kind of need something like that in order to balance out the seriousness that the characters will exhibit, but for me, this is a bit too overkill. I'm trying not to be too harsh on the actor Ahmed Best. I apologize if I got the name incorrect. Due to the backlash that this guy received, he was pushed to the point where he was considering suicide. This is not just some internet trolls randomly who scream into the void about how much they hate a certain Star Wars movie. This has real-world consequences. One example among many that just kind of makes me ashamed to be part of the Star Wars fandom. Same thing goes for the backlash that people like Jake Lloyd received, or Hayden Christensen, Daisy Ridley, and even Kelly Marie Tran in The Last Jedi. Can you name any other character that received the same type of backlash that this guy got? And if anyone says it was Rose Tico in Last Jedi,
No, not by a long shot.
Jar Jar was probably the most hated character in all of cinema. His use in the movie, for the most part, is very tone-deaf, where it injects a lot of unnecessary humor for the sake of it, and to me it just comes off as George Lucas trying to show off something that he created for the sake of it, rather than actually serving a purpose, which Jar Jar does serve a purpose by the end battle. Ironically, though, he's probably the only one in this movie that has a clear character arc of some kind, or at least has the most development next to Anakin Skywalker, and yet those two characters got the most hate and backlash. But he leads Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon into the Gungan city where he was supposedly banished for being too clumsy. One thing I really like about this is the world building that it showcases here. With all the issues I have with the prequels, and I think it's not really unheard of when it comes to the pros of the prequel trilogy, the world building is probably the strongest point. In the other two trilogies, we do get some good world building moments, but it's kind of outer world planets that don't really have much civilian populations of some kind. There's some here and there, but in comparison to the prequel trilogy, we get Naboo and Coruscant. And we see Tatooine, yes, but we see a different side of it. Besides maybe the Marvel Universe, Star Wars has an endless rabbit hole of world building that it can go off of, whether it's in the books, comics, video games, animated shows, you get the idea. But once again, the problems are still present here. They still come off as very stoic and formal, and they don't really take that stoic mask off to really show their humanity. One particular moment that always really bothered me is when Jar Jar goes, "Misa back!" is we just see Obi-Wan standing there with a blank look on his face. I think if this was any other director, Obi-Wan would have been going like this.
Yeah, Captain Topos, Misa back.
And as they're navigating their way through the deep waters, they run into various monster creatures below that almost get them killed. Jar Jar is the only one who's terrified. Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon are just kind of staying really calm throughout these entire situations. I get that it helps to maintain your composure in a scary situation. Showing some kind of fear or anxiety goes a long way. Then we're introduced to Queen Amidala, played by Natalie Portman, who's gone on to win an Oscar award for Black Swan. I love Natalie Portman, but her portrayal of Padme frustrates me just as much as Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon. No backstory or personality is given to her at all. This is the mother of Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia. On the one hand, we see her coming from a royalty background, which only carries on to her daughter. Besides that, we don't really understand what her personality and motivations are. And the fact that she just casually goes along with Qui-Gon on the planet Tatooine, having dinner with Anakin and his mother, not really seeming that concerned about what's going on with her people. I know I'm repeating this, but it helps to have that sense of urgency and agency, and that's probably the biggest problem with this movie. Yeah, obviously a lot of people will call out the bad acting, but really what it boils down to is the lack of characterization and agency. Because Naboo is being invaded illegally by this Trade Federation army, and nobody really seems that upset about it, not even the Queen herself. And we're told multiple times that this is a really dangerous situation that needs to be resolved, but I don't really feel that from any of the characters in here. Nothing convinces me that anybody's really that scared about what's going to happen, except for Jar Jar Binks, I guess. Another thing that was pointed out by Goldman in his Phantom Menace video last year, if this was something along the lines of Thor Ragnarok, where we saw how Hela was wreaking havoc on Asgard and everybody was throwing everything they had at her, if we saw something like that, at least in the Phantom Menace, I think that would have really gone a long way. I already know the answer to this question, but was anybody in the room with George Lucas tapping him on the shoulder saying, George, maybe we should do it this way because that would actually make the movie better? No, there wasn't. If you doubt me, watch the documentary of this movie, which is very, very revealing. We're deviating here for a second. I am not a hater of George Lucas at all. I do have a lot of respect for the guy. I think he's someone who has a really good idea, but he doesn't really know how to properly play out the cards that he's been given. It's a common thing that we hear in the prequels, of great ideas, poor execution. That's really what it comes down to here. As opposed to his role in the original trilogy, well, the original film, A New Hope, he had people kind of keeping him in line, stopping him from going too far in certain areas. And in this case, he had all the control, and he had a bunch of yes men who didn't challenge his ideas. Now, some people will argue that's actually a good thing, that he had all the control as opposed to a studio controlling everything. I don't really think so. That's just as bad as the opposite problem. But they managed to get onto the ship and barely get past the blockade of Trade Federation ships, with the help of R2-D2, who we learn at this point in time was serving for the Queen in Naboo. I do really like seeing the introduction of R2, seeing where he came from. I couldn't help but smile and go, "What's up, little guy?" So they arrive on Tatooine, the ship's been damaged, and they have to go find parts for it in the nearby settlement, Mos Espa. Not Mos Eisley or Anchorhead, which for some reason, I always got those mixed up. I thought they were visiting Mos Eisley when I was a kid, and I realized, oh wait, that's Mos Espa. Never mind. I'm talking about a lot of the nostalgic memories I have with this movie, because all the other stuff, like with the games, hearing certain sound effects and musical cues, kind of takes me right back to that time. But anyway, they go to the shop that's led by a Toydarian named Watto, introducing us to Anakin Skywalker, played by the one and only Jake Lloyd. Oh, Jake Lloyd. Let me just get this out of the way. Same thing applies with Ahmed Best's Jar Jar. I got nothing against Jake Lloyd. I don't blame the guy at all. He was just following orders, and he did not deserve any of the backlash that he got. This guy has not had an easy life since then. The acting of Jake Lloyd isn't exactly that great, but I don't really expect that much from kid actors anyway, unless they're paired up with a really good director. I mean, the delivery of George Lucas dialogue is pretty hard to swallow at certain points in this movie, but since he's a kid, I'm able to kind of let that go. And him and Padme's first interaction, I do kind of like seeing that, knowing what the future holds for the two of them. Although I kind of would have preferred it if Anakin was much older than he is in this movie, because he's apparently 9 years old, and I guess Padme's 13 or 14. It's not an original idea, aging up Anakin Skywalker. If it was Hayden Christensen's version, I think they would have gone a lot better. Maybe if we saw a flashback of Jake Lloyd, I think that would have been a lot more beneficial. But besides Jar Jar, ironically, Anakin is probably the most developed character in this movie. We get to see what his home life was like, his relationship with his mother, Shmi Skywalker, and he actually doesn't have a father. He was born in a virgin birth. We'll get to that in a minute, though. But he's also a skilled pilot and a mechanic, just like his son. But clearly, this kid is capable and knows how to do things, and he actually wants to help people, and he likes to help people. Him offering to take part in the pod race in order to help get the money for the parts that Qui-Gon needs actually does tell us a good amount about him as a character. And I think it's fairly well showcased in the dinner scene, where he tries to talk his mother into letting him join the pod racing. And he's able to deduce that Qui-Gon is a Jedi, not just by seeing his lightsaber on his belt, but he's also able to kind of see through his bluff and saying, no, you're here for another reason. Why else would you be here? Clearly, Qui-Gon is really impressed and knows that there's something special about Anakin. I do kind of like the mentor-student, father-son-like bond that develops between the two. I do kind of wish that it was with Obi-Wan as well, but believe me, guys, I'm trying to be as balanced as I can here. Also, I gotta point out about Watto, probably my favorite interaction, if not one of my favorite interactions, is when Qui-Gon tries to use the Jedi mind trick on him and it's not working.
Credits will do fine.
No, they won't. No money, no parts, no deal.
Watto's just a side character in this one, but he actually has a clear personality. Yet again, another breath of fresh air. Of some kind, at least. And as far as the bond between Anakin and his mother Shmi, it's not really that well focused on, but I think it's actually one of the more heartfelt aspects of the movie, because especially as someone who has a close relationship with his mother, that I think really speaks wonders. Especially when we see how the rest of his journey plays out into becoming Darth Vader. This was the beginning of his path towards the darkness, and how he had to eventually leave his mother behind even though he didn't really want to. And most of the time, father and son relationships take the center stage in fiction. Does not hurt at all to see a mother and son take the center stage for a change. But while we're on the subject, she tells Qui-Gon that there wasn't a father for Anakin, that she just carried him and gave birth and can't explain what happened. So George Lucas decides to make Anakin the Chosen One. A lot of people either love the Chosen One or they hate the Chosen One prophecy. I don't really subscribe to either one of those, but the thing that really gets me the most is that it doesn't really have an impact on the overall saga. It's just mentioned a few times, and it doesn't really do anything to enhance the saga. It only causes more confusion, especially with the topic of the rise of Skywalker with Palpatine's return. I don't like Palpatine's return necessarily, but the fact that the Chosen One prophecy caused people to say that it was ruined because Palpatine returned, I am not going to get into that. I'm going to save that for when we get to The Rise of Skywalker later this year. Yes, I'm making an announcement right here. Rise of Skywalker 5 years later is definitely coming. But George Lucas really threw it in there just to remind people that Anakin is important for some reason. Obviously, as Star Wars fans, we all know where the journey of Anakin Skywalker is going to go. But for casual audience members, they may or may not know this. I don't really think it's necessary to put the Chosen One prophecy in there. I do kind of like the idea in theory, and if it was done in a way to enhance the story, I would have been fine with it. But here, it's only mentioned a few handful of times and doesn't really add anything to the overall saga. But then when they take a sample of his midichlorian count and they realize that this is unlike anything that they've ever seen from any Jedi, including Master Yoda, hearing the quiet sound effects of the sha sha sha, knowing the future implications of Anakin's journey, admittedly I did get shivers hearing that. Oh god, I just realized. Midichlorians. Some of you are probably gonna not be happy with what I gotta say because some people have accepted it. Fair enough. And in the Mandalorian series, they do call it the M count instead of midichlorians. It's a way of including them without necessarily spelling it out. Me personally, I don't like them. I prefer the original explanation of the Force by Obi-Wan in A New Hope.
It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us, it penetrates us, it binds the galaxy together.
I know I sound like an old head when I talk about it like this. It's now part of the canon, I get that, but still. It doesn't take me out of the movie or anything, but I don't really think it's necessary. We don't really need to know what the Force is really like. Obi-Wan's explanation in the original was good enough for me. If anybody else is alright with the midichlorian explanation, fair enough, more power to you. Then we have the pod racing sequence, which admittedly in its own way is kind of fun to watch. Once in a while I do watch it on YouTube just for the fun of it. The thing I've always really liked and noticed especially on rewatch is how atmospheric this whole setting is. We see all the various side characters coming out with the flags representing the pod racers, and John Williams' music is queuing up. It almost makes you feel like you're actually in a NASCAR race of some kind. I kind of like the hype and excitement surrounding it. And we also get to see a small appearance from Jabba the Hutt, which obviously even the general audience is going to know who that is. And for about 3/4 of the sequence, I think other people have talked about this, there's no music. It's really just the sound effects most of the time. And that's another thing that I gotta give credit for. Ben Burt, who's the sound mixer for this, he usually is really on point with the sound mixing, but he, I think, along with Attack of the Clones, outdoes himself here. Particularly the way Sebulba's pod racer sounds, along with Anakin's. Unfortunately, this sequence was somewhat tainted for me because if you watch Chris Stuckman's original review of the Phantom Menace back in the day, he talks about how almost every single shot in the sequence goes from left to right. Now on rewatch, I was paying close attention here. It was pretty noticeable. It doesn't really ruin it for me, but it was somewhat tainted, unfortunately. I never caught on to that until he brought it up all that time ago. And in a way, it does bring back some nostalgic memories of the Star Wars pod racing video game. It's working! It's working! Unfortunately, as reasonably fun as the sequence is, Anakin doesn't really show any anxiety or fear of what's going to happen. He just kind of casually sits there, fixing his pod racer as it goes on whenever he experiences trouble. Doesn't really say, oh god, hold on, we gotta fix this, hang on, almost there. Nothing like that. But Rey has trouble piloting the Falcon to escape from the First Order, and she's still a Mary Sue.
Yeah, okay.
But inevitably, Anakin wins the race, and I do like seeing the response from the people, including his mother, who is very proud of him. And also to rewind for a second, when Qui-Gon challenges Watto on who's going to win the race, I like how he manages to rig the game of chance in Anakin's favor, and he just shrugs at Watto. Another small moment, but I've always really liked that. Which leads us to probably what I would say is the best scene in the whole movie. I gotta admit, I did get a little misty-eyed watching it, and I like how Qui-Gon doesn't demean Anakin for his attachment to his mother, because more than likely deep down, if I had to guess, he knows how hard it is for someone Anakin's age to let go. And I really think that Shmi's last words to Anakin as he leaves can really speak to you on a deep level, especially me, where you get so attached to something that you know you gotta let go in order to embrace what's coming for you in the future. Not to sound preachy or anything, but I think anybody can learn from that. And that leads us to probably the most boring sequence of the entire movie. The movie up until now was alright at best, but this sequence really crashes the movie harder into the ground because it's all about a bunch of politics that don't really matter in the long run for me. Now, to be fair, a friend of mine actually pointed this out and how it's very similar to what Strauss said about working in the shadows or something behind the scenes. When I talk about Strauss, I'm talking about Oppenheimer. Just had to look it up. Real power hiding in the shadows, which is what the Queen was able to do by taking back her planet. Palpatine does the same thing in order to become Chancellor from Senator. Those aspects I think are actually kind of neat. Execution aside, George Lucas really had a reason for everything he did with this trilogy. So in that area, I will give him credit for having a really good concept to go on. It's just the way he carried it out that was the problem. Not an original take, but unfortunately it's the truth. But really the only purpose that it serves is to stall the characters in order for him to become Chancellor, and causing Amidala to raise some kind of a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum, who clearly doesn't really have that much power as we were led to believe. And that's another thing. She's trying to convince everybody that her planet's being invaded. She doesn't really get that upset about it, and how nobody really believes her. The fact that she's so stoic in her demeanor, not a good idea, guys. I swear to God, if someone tells me that that was the point of the character, as well as the others, I'm gonna lose my freaking mind. And the thing about the Jedi, my problems with the Jedi Council are more present in the following two prequels, but here they're just kind of there to say to Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan that the boy's too old, he shouldn't be trained. But again, like with most of the other characters, they don't really show that much agency or urgency. I know I keep repeating that, but it does go a long way, guys. When Qui-Gon brings up the idea that it was a Sith Lord that attacked him, nobody really seems that fazed by it.
The Sith have been extinct for a millennium.
I do not believe the Sith could have returned without us knowing.
You don't really sound that surprised there, buddy. I just realized I haven't really talked much about Obi-Wan. I love Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan Kenobi, especially in the Kenobi series. He's a really solid actor, and from what I could tell, a really nice guy. I think he's better in the following two prequels, especially Episode 3. But here, he just kind of stands around and is largely reactive to what's going on in the plot. Not really that much character. The same thing can be said in the other two prequels, but here, he's just wasted. He does kind of look like a young Ewan McGregor, though, I'll admit, and starts to look progressively more like him as the trilogy goes on. But we don't really learn anything about Obi-Wan in this movie. No clear desire or motivation from him, and the same thing can be said about Qui-Gon Jinn. I love Liam Neeson, but the character on the page, especially in front of the camera, is not really that compelling. We get hints of his personality and how he likes to defy the Council, and is also not afraid to tell off Padme when she's going a little too far with her skepticism. Besides that, what else can you tell me about Qui-Gon? There's no depth that the audiences are craving, especially in a franchise like Star Wars. I do kind of like the moment that he has with Obi-Wan later on Naboo before the fight starts, and how he feels that he hasn't really been a good apprentice for Qui-Gon, and Qui-Gon praises him, saying that actually you're a much more wiser Jedi than I am. Past that point, the bond between Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon is pretty boring. There's really no sense of camaraderie or playful banter that they have between the two, as we saw in the original trilogy, or even in the sequel trilogy with Rey, Finn, and Poe. I know I'm mentioning the sequels too, but they even have their pros, guys. It's not all negative. At a certain point with the Coruscant sequence, I was finding myself checking the clock. This goes on for about half an hour. People will argue that Pisana and Canto Bight sequences are worse than this.
No, not by a long shot.
No chance in hell. Those two sequences, as problematic as they might be, they actually do serve a narrative purpose. Yes, this one does too, but it is such a slog. People wandering around, walking around rooms and sitting around and talking, and nobody really seems that enthused or energetic at all. There's no shred of humanity, except for maybe a small glimpse or two here and there. As I mentioned earlier with Obi-Wan standing with a blank stare on his face next to Jar Jar, this shot of Natalie Portman right here just makes me cringe, and it's just another example of my main critique on how portraying your characters as stoic is never a good idea. I know it's probably the 1,000,000th time that I've mentioned that already, but I know some people still aren't going to get the point. In fact, by the time this moment happens, when Jar Jar gets excited that they're going home, I actually felt the same way and went, about time. Queen Amidala enlists Jar Jar's help to get the Gungan army to help them against the droids. So they manage to form an alliance, although Padme reveals that she is Queen Amidala and that the Queen is actually a decoy of some kind. Everybody else seems to be shocked except for Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon. It's like they already knew or something. Never really understood what that was all about, but neither here nor there. So they're coming up with a plan to take down the droid army and capture the Viceroy, who need Padme to sign a paper of some kind to make the invasion legal, which is something that Palpatine wants to happen in order to gain the power, but he already managed to do that with Padme calling for a no confidence vote in Valorum, so he didn't really need her to sign that paper. So what was the point of that anyway? Certainly not as captivating as him playing on the emotions of Luke in order to get him to join him in the darkness. And even with him doing the same thing to Rey in Rise of Skywalker. As far as the big climactic battle, it's alright in certain areas, and it's kind of fun, depending on which aspect you're talking about. The ground battle between the Gungans and the droids, I think is actually somewhat entertaining, but after a while it just gets kind of tiresome. Probably the only time in the Star Wars saga that we see a ground battle between troops. The closest that we get is Rogue One, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and even The Last Jedi. And with Queen Amidala and her personal guard trying to take over the throne room where the Viceroy's hiding, that I don't really think was needed. You could have just cut that out right there. Maybe show a shot or two of them just running through the hallway battling the droids. Then when the Naboo starfighters go up to take down the droid control ship, nowhere near as exciting as the attack on the Death Star was, because there is no weak spot that we know of that can take down the droid control ship. And Anakin manages to accidentally get up there and cause the destruction to happen, rather than being proactive in destroying the ship. I think that would have really helped if Qui-Gon told him to stay there and he said, no, I gotta try to do something here. I gotta stop this from happening. He could at least show that he was capable of doing something great. And he manages to destroy the control ship with complete ease. Almost complete ease. And yet people throw their hands up in the air in frustration whenever Rey does something, even when she struggles.
Yeah, okay.
But then there's the fight with Darth Maul, which many consider to be the highlight of this movie. In fact, if you were to talk to anybody, this is probably the most memorable part of The Phantom Menace alone. Largely, I think it's because of the musical piece, Duel of the Fates. I'll admit, I do play it on my phone every once in a while, especially when I'm driving on the highway, which is definitely not safe at all. In fact, any Star Wars music you play on the highway in your car, I would advise against that, because potentially you could go at very dangerous high speeds. The same thing can be said for the Back to the Future theme. No surprise coming from me, the fight itself is actually quite entertaining, especially when you pair it with John Williams' music. The wide and long takes that are present here from George Lucas's direction really enhances the rewatchability for this sequence. Yes, it's obviously choreographed, but we do get a really good sense that these are Jedi Knights in their prime. Seeing Obi-Wan psych out Darth Maul as they leap from one walkway to the other, I've always really liked that. In fact, my favorite part of the entire sequence is this moment right here. I can't play the music because of copyright, but if you watch the sequence, you'll know what I mean. Qui-Gon Jinn gets stabbed to death by Darth Maul. Ewan McGregor is good at delivering his emotional response, but unfortunately due to the lack of characterization from Qui-Gon, I don't really feel anything, as opposed to Obi-Wan in the original film, or even Han Solo in The Force Awakens, where we see the mentor get killed by the main villain. In fact, if it wasn't for John Williams' music, I probably wouldn't have really liked this sequence that much. On that note, the Duel of the Fates is called the Duel of the Fates because it's something that Dave Filoni said some years back. Again, this is another thing that the Goldman pointed out in his video last year. He said, Dave Filoni, and I checked out the video, Qui-Gon is doing this in order to protect the fate of Anakin, and that if he dies, Anakin's going to be in big trouble by falling into the hands of the Sith or something if Darth Maul gets his hands on him. I don't really feel that at all. Not in the least bit. The impression that I've always gotten is that a Sith Lord has appeared for the first time in 1,000 years, and the Jedi feel the need to stop him from coming back. If that was the only reason for it, I would have been totally fine with that, and I have no ill will towards Dave Filoni at all. Qui-Gon really cares about the safety and well-being of Anakin. Why did he bring him here in the first place? Why couldn't he just leave him with a Jedi back on planet Coruscant? Or even leave him with one of the Gungans who isn't part of the fight? Now, when it comes to Darth Maul, I don't really have anything else to add, other than the fact that in this movie at least, he is just bland and boring. Now obviously, Dave Filoni has managed to repair the damage somewhat by showing him in the Clone Wars, but I'm talking about this film alone. He has nothing to him as a character at all. He's just there to look scary and have a cool lightsaber fight with the two leading Jedi. Not an original thought, but if he was the main villain in all three of these movies, I think the trilogy would have been a lot better off. Not just with the originals and Darth Vader, but even the sequel trilogy managed to do that with Kylo Ren. Naboo is freed, and Palpatine is now Chancellor, promising to watch over Anakin's career with great interest, which, by the way, I've always really liked that moment, knowing exactly how their journeys play out later on. And another detail that I've always really liked as Qui-Gon's cremation is happening, when Yoda and Mace Windu are talking about who was destroyed, the Master or the Apprentice, George Lucas manages to slowly linger the camera onto Palpatine as in a way to subtly tell you, there he is. That's the Master. Obviously, we know as Star Wars fans who Palpatine's going to become, but the general audience who isn't really familiar with the lore of Star Wars, they're probably not going to know, and they'll probably think, could he potentially be the one other Sith Lord? Little things like that I think are really neat. I had a lot of stuff to talk about with Phantom Menace. Again, I'm trying to reiterate here. I know I sounded really negative most of the time, but I don't hate this movie. In my experience anyway, I don't really think there's any Star Wars movie that I really loathe. I know for some other people it's different, but for myself, I haven't really had that experience as of yet. Phantom Menace is not an awful movie or anything. Maybe by Star Wars standards you consider it to be awful, but overall it's a really huge letdown, especially in comparison to what came before. Bland and boring characters that don't really add anything, and a plot that has no sense of urgency of any kind. Has some entertaining scenes, and I do like seeing some of the seeds of certain plot threads that are paid off later on throughout the saga. And to be honest with you guys, out of all the 11 movies, I think Phantom Menace is the worst one and might actually be my least favorite to watch because I find it to be so boring. Even with all the good things that I pointed out, to me that's not really enough to save it. Some people out there, and maybe some of you guys will argue that The Rise of Skywalker deserves that title.
Sorry, no.
No?
Nope. Not even close.
Not even a little!
I think I would rather watch the sequel trilogy over this movie any day of the week. I know that some of you are probably going to be upset over that. Rise of Skywalker, I don't necessarily love that movie, but at least the characters do have some understandable motivations. The characters in that movie do feel like characters. Can't really say the same thing about this one. Again, not a hateable movie, and it does have its moments, but to me, it's not quite enough. I know some of you like it or even love it. That's awesome. That's great. You can like it all you want. Me personally, though, not so much. Those are my thoughts on The Phantom Menace. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope I didn't upset too many of you guys, and if I did, well, you have the right to feel that way if you want to. Whatever your thoughts are on The Phantom Menace, just comment below and tell me what they are, and as always, see you in the next one.